Hi everyone, welcome to today's SilverlightShow webinar. My name is Svetla and I'm glad to introduce you today to our webinar presenter, Samidp Basu. Samidp is delivering his second webinar for SilverlightShow and I hope it will be yet another success like the previous one. So the topic of today's webinar is 10 best practices for Windows Phone developers. I hope you will be able to find out about lots of interesting tips and tricks that Samidp may suggest you. We have, as usual, about 70 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have a short 10-minute Q&A session in which Samidp will try to reply to as many questions as he may fit in this time frame. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to address them from your webinar panel. So you have a chat option in your webinar panel, so you can type the questions. Please provide as many details as possible so Samidp may refer to the exact topic you're addressing. So all questions will be replied at the end. We have some ebook giveaways for this webinar, which Samidp will mention. So you can win some ebooks from SilverlightShow and Pact Publishing for tweeting this webinar as well as for participating in our post-webinar survey. All right, so Samidp, can we begin?
Sure. All right, well, thank you, Svetla, for the introduction, and I guess we'll get started.
You're welcome.
So thank you, everyone who was on the webinar. Thank you so much for your time. As you know, this is the SilverlightShow webinar on 10 best practices for Windows Phone developers. I hope to speak for just about an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions if you have any. All right, this is my contact page, so to speak. I live and work in Columbus, Ohio. I work for a company called Sujeti, and in here you also see my email and my Twitter handle and my blog. So you know a few ways to get hold of me. So any questions you have which we maybe could not answer during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. All right, and since this is a SilverlightShow webinar, I'm hoping most of you know about what we do here at SilverlightShow. It's really a great resource if you're doing any kind of WPF, Silverlight, XAML, Windows 8, Windows Phone type development. There are daily news updates and exclusive articles and ebooks and webinars like this. So definitely bookmark SilverlightShow and come back to us for more of the content. And like Svetla was mentioning, we do have a few ebook giveaways. So I would really appreciate some feedback at the end of the seminar. So 3 of you who leave us some feedback, you get to win the ebooks that I had authored for SilverlightShow in the past. And if you tweet during the seminar with a certain hashtag, you are also going to be in contention to win 2 ebooks from Pact Publishing, mostly around Silverlight, Windows Phone and data handling. All right, so let's get started. And like I said, this is going to be 10 best practices, so to speak, for Windows Phone developers. And I want to make sure our expectations are right. This will not be a lot of heavy hands-on like live coding session. This is more like a set of resources, things we need to keep in mind as Windows Phone developers as we are writing our apps. And I do not wish to, I guess, say all of these things from a very expert standpoint, because I'm really not. I'm just a very regular developer like most of you. But these are things that I always try to keep in mind when I'm doing my Windows Phone apps. So this is kind of what we wish to cover today. I lost my mouse for a second. All right, here we go. So we are actually going to start off in a different mode, and it's not quite like developer mode, but Metro design principles, they are very, very important because we're talking about the whole ecosystem now. We are talking about Windows Phone and Windows 8 and maybe even your Xbox that looks very Metro-ish. So even if we do not have a design background, it helps to somewhat understand where they're coming from. What is the design principle? What is the inspiration behind Metro? Because UX or user experience is not something that can be an afterthought. It's something we start out planning as we make our apps. So we're going to spend like 15 minutes or so just talking about Metro. And then we'll talk about some common UX guidelines and where we go wrong. What are some of the pitfalls? And how do we plan our application and we set ourselves up for success? Then we're going to step back. We might switch a little bit between Visual Studio and the presentation. We're going to look at the SDK. What are some new things? We're going to look at some testing options, how you market and monetize your apps, when should you consider leveraging the cloud infrastructure. There are some fantastic toolkits and like third-party tool sets that are at our disposal. So the whole point is let's make sure we're using the right tools for the job. And we're going to end with some resources and some patterns and frameworks and when they apply. So this is our sort of our agenda, and we're going to try covering as much of this as we can in an hour. All right, so let's begin with Metro, and I will warn you, you might see a little bit of a switch of templates because I wanted to keep the Metro feel in some of the slides. So let's start talking about maybe some of the background, like why are you inspired to write an app, and how should your users perceive your application as they're using it? So here's some background on where Metro started for the Windows Phone team. I'm going to show you some imagery here which have nothing to do with Windows Phone, but hopefully you see a common trend in all of them. You see bold use of color, you see bold use of typography, clean content, and without any decorations, right? Excuse me. So you see that, and then you see, and again, these are language independent, so you're seeing some German maybe, some breadbaskets, and you see some flashcards. Again, you see the use of color, you see how the text is so prominent. And again, just some Japanese, so it's not just tied to one language and one way of showing things. This kind of demonstrates how strong words can be. I'm told when Windows Phone was being designed and conceptualized, they looked at Helvetica as a font, and we all know that Windows Phone uses, Metro uses Sego UI as a font, but Helvetica is kind of close. And one of the best letters to understand the difference between the different fonts is the letter T in its capital form. If you look at other fonts like Sans or any other fonts, I guess, you will see the adornments where the edges of the T are swirled and so on. But Helvetica and Sego, they just maintain a very simple mechanism of just portraying the fonts as it is. All right, this one's kind of my some of my favorite posters, I guess. Down on the left-hand side, you see a Little Miss Sunshine. This was a movie some years back. And it's an awkward poster because you not normally put a yellow van on a yellow poster with this little bit of content and so much of white space. But it's still a strong poster. So the point is, white space isn't bad if used correctly. I also like the girl on the right-hand side, the North Face poster. It talks about, or I mean, it shows content. It shows a girl who's hopefully comfortable in her hoodie. So she is the content, right? So the point is, if your content is strong enough, maybe the Chrome can be in the background. People will find out what it's about. Like in this poster, you will find out that it's a North Face jacket that they're talking about, right? So content over Chrome is what we're trying to emphasize. So having looked at some of these inspirations, let's try to see how we define the Metro design language. What are some common things we hear when we talk about Metro? And these are 5 or 6 terms that you'll hear over and over again. And it's funny, in some, if you have been to a Microsoft conference in the last 1 year, some of these terms have become like drinking games because they say fast and fluid like 30 times in the presentation. But then jokes aside, I guess the point is what the story that they're trying to convey is a very compelling one, right? Windows Phone came in at a time when iOS and Android have been around for a while, and there are other platforms. So it's hard to do something which is distinctly different. And we're not saying at all that others are wrong or bad. It's just we are very different. And it helps to understand some of these design philosophies so that our apps can feel a part of the rest of the operating system, right? So we're going to try to maybe break down some of these things and understand what it means to be fast and fluid, what it means to be authentically digital, and so on. So again, just trying to wrap up quickly on Metro, there are 3 key influences behind Metro as a design language. One is modern design, And this kind of started with the Bauhaus school of thought. This is a school in Germany which was popular in the 1920s and 30s. The point was what they tried doing was outside of the Industrial Revolution. They tried to preach a very simplistic design principle where they would make things which are without any adornment, and just a function of what they're making could be beautiful, right? And then Swiss design is what we commonly known as the International Typographic Style. They are actually inspired by the Bauhaus school of thought, and they have a huge emphasis on typography. And motion design is also an inspiration because, I mean, as we all know, movies are inspiring. We love watching movies, and motion is something nice. So if your application on a tablet or on a phone feels fluid and like fast and moving, you sense the motion, and it's nice, right? So those are some of the inspirations. Modern design, as we talked about, it was about doing something with fierce reductionism. So if you consider a chair, why can't a chair just be beautiful by its function and not have to decorate that overly, right? So that was the Bauhaus school of thought. And what we're seeing today is kind of a similar age where we should not take things from the past and try to do things in the present, right? One of the funny examples I hear is in most applications we have a save button, right? And the save button has like a floppy type image, and your kids are going to ask, what is that floppy disk, right? Because they have never maybe seen a floppy. So our tools, our products, and our creations need to represent the fact that we are in this mobile age where everyone's doing touch first. Now we move on to Swiss design, and what the Swiss did was they took that inspiration and said, these are things we're going to focus on: cleanliness, readability, and beautiful graphic design. And words they're the center of what you present in your app, right? So typography is important, and so is a grid. You'll hear me talk about the grid a little bit later on, but the point is a grid is just a list of rows and columns where you can place your content on a screen. And that grid really helps because it gives you symmetry. Things are balanced, and that hierarchy, that symmetry, makes it more pleasant. And you'll also see bold use of color and photography, like we saw in that North Face poster. Photography instead of illustrations is nice. And these are some examples that I've seen other people talk about when they wanted to be inspired by movies. So if you do a YouTube search on kinetic typography, you'll see how they have some videos where the words move by themselves, and that's not a bad thing. So you don't need Windows, you don't need the Chrome. How about the words moving by themselves? And two other great examples are Star Wars and Catch Me If You Can. If you look at the opening credits of these movies, you will see a very Metro lookish look and feel. I mean, even though these things came way before Metro design. All right, so that's some of the inspiration, that's some of the principles, but here are some very real-world things that Metro is inspired by. The aviation system, the transportation system, all the train stations and airports in the world. You'll see people going through them, and mostly they figured out where to go. And the reason is things are very simple and clear and universal. This photograph on the left-hand side with the Wall Street Uptown 4 and 5, this is one of my favorite ones, because it shows that your life is in motion. Like you're running to get to a train or a plane, and when you're doing that, you will be really thankful that the designer who painted that did not decorate. It's just very simple and tells you right up front to say where you need to go, and just a little bit of use of color to attract your attention. And you see more examples of airport signage. So let's take all of that and let's see what we need to do as developers. How are we going to take those inspirations into principles? So the modern design means that we are going to reduce things down to the essence. We are not going to over-decorate our content. Whatever our apps present, that is the content, and that can be the king. That can be the center of everything that we present. Our font and our typography needs to be consistent, clear, and honest and beautiful. And motion is nice. So transition between UI is important. It's nice because it gives the user a feeling of something changed, something moved, right? So you'll commonly hear us talking about how you use animations between your pages and your XAML pages or your HTML5 pages in Windows 8. The transition between pages, the transition between controls as you're bringing in data, as you're maybe exiting one control and bringing in another one, those are important because those are that gives them that fluid and fast visual impact. Here are some principles that we live by: light and simple, typography and motion, like we already talked about, content, not Chrome, right? So no Windows, it's your content first. Pride in craftsmanship, this is something important. We need to be, I mean, most developers, we stand by our code, and that's not a bad thing, but we need to be confident, and we need to make sure that we are putting in the best effort in our product, because that the product really represents you, right? So let's take pride in what we create. And that authenticated digital, we'll cover that in a little bit. You'll see how we should not bring things from the real world as illustrations into our Windows Phone or Windows 8 apps. And that Win as one is important because Windows Phone and Windows 8, they have some gestures, some common ways of doing things. There's an application bar. You can swipe from the left, swipe from the right, or top or bottom. Those are nice things to stick to. You don't have to. But the point is, if you are asking your users to learn new ways of doing things, it's just more difficult for them. So being a part of the overall ecosystem is helpful. So having talked about Metro, let's go into some common UX guidelines, things that we need to keep in mind. So Windows Phone, as we know, and again, I mean, you will not hear me say one bad thing about iOS or Android, because I mean, they have been around for a long time. There's a lot to learn from those guys. But at the same time, we can be proud in the fact that we are different, right? We are infographic versus them being iconographic. We do not take things from the real world and do illustrations and metaphors in the phone app, because I mean, your creation lives on a little 4.3-inch screen maybe, right? So it does not have any life outside of the screen. So whatever you communicate with your users is that through that screen. That's where your creation lives. So one classic example is if you look at this Android clock, it gives you time, and that's not something we'll ever do in the Metro design because, again, if you want to give them the time, just give them the time digitally. We don't take illustrations from the real world very often. Now, here's some system navigation and hierarchy things that we need to keep in mind. We sometimes, in our zest to write more and more apps, we sometimes forget that Windows Phone has this very basic hub and spoke model. So what you see here on screen, the start button, that is like the start button on your phone, right? And that's the user's safety net, for example, because if anything were to go wrong in an app, he hits the start button to come back to his home screen or start screen. So we always need to honor that, and actually we don't need to do anything. It's going to come to the start screen anyways. But then you see these little circles, which are like almost like the home screen of every app, right? So from the start screen or from the app list, the user taps on something and they launch an app. Like that's the home screen. That's the first time your app is seeing the user. And beyond that, you might have multiple pages. You might load multiple XAML pages in your frame. And the point is, it needs to be a linear model. You need to have a consistent way to go from the home page down to the second and the third levels, and so on. So if you have two third-level pages in two different parts of your application, the user needs to get to them in a similar way, so it's consistent. And as we'll see in the next few slides, we need to trust and we need to honor the hardware, right? And most of this comes free. The Bing or the search key, this used to be context specific in the past before Mango, but they realized that people were doing all kinds of different implementations of it. So now hitting the search always brings you to Bing, and hitting the start always brings you to the home screen. It is the back button that we really need to take care of, and we need to make sure that the user experience is consistent. So if I go back a few slides here, if you notice that all of these are my pages, right? So if I have circular navigation from page number 3 to page number 5, so from page number 5, if the user hits back, he's really coming back to page 3, and he's going to get into this loop and not be able to exit my app very quickly. So that's something we absolutely want to avoid. All right, and we need to be predictable in our app. So our app needs to have consistent UI and one way of getting to different pages and getting to the same hierarchy of contents. The integration of experiences is something important because I personally feel Windows Phone till date is possibly the best Microsoft implementation of bringing all their services in one place, right? So you have Bing, you have Xbox, you have Office, all of those are in one place. So if your app really makes sense to belong in the People Hub or in the Music Hub or in the Pictures Hub, please absolutely do that, because your user is going to love the fact that he can launch your app while he's in one of these hubs. So that integration of experiences is nice. All right. Page structure. What I mean by this is, as we envision how our app is going to work, we're going to obviously break it down into some pages, right? So these are I'm talking about sample pages here. Now it's important that our page, you got to remember that this is a small form factor, right? So our page could not be doing a whole lot of things, because then the user is going to get confused. There's too much content on the page. So it's essential to prioritize and let the user do one thing in a page, one thing which is the primary function. Maybe there are some secondary things you'll do, but it's not as important as the primary one. And the secondary ones could belong in the app bar. But it's important to break up your application into all these pages and break them up in a way that makes sense. Excuse me. Visual design, we're going to talk about this a little bit in maybe I'll show you a live demo. But if you notice the screen on the right hand side, it has a little grid, which you don't normally see in the phone, but it's always there. It is what is the crux of Metro. It's what gives us symmetry and hierarchy, right? So it's okay if you start with a very default look and feel, which is Metro, and that's nice because some of the templates that we get in our SDK, they already get us a long way to being like a Metro style app. But then it's okay if you inject your own brand, if you do your own thing. And it's also absolutely okay to be inspired by the apps that are in there, the OS level apps, to see how they're doing things. If you need to present content in a list, take a look at how the OS does it and then make it your own, right? And actually, while we're on this screen, let me show you a quick example here. So I'm going to run, I'm in Visual Studio. I have a very basic phone application open, as you'll see, and I'm going to run it so you can see it. And we're going to step back in a second and go to see what it is. So what I'm trying to show you here is this is a very simple phone application. All that I've done is I've not changed anything in the template. I just hit File, New Project, and then I've just stuck to the basic project template, right? So that just gives us a blank page which says page name and my application. But the thing that you see here is I'm in debug mode. So we are used to those counters, the frame rate counters on the left. But you also see a list of red squares, right? So that's the grid. And this actually is very helpful because it tells you right away whether your content is aligned or not, right? So you see the page name and you see the page application. 12 pixels is kind of like the magic number in Metro. Things need to be aligned right. And the built-in resources, built-in styles that we have for Windows Phone controls, they will get you that, that common styling. But if you are doing your own styling, it's wonderful to just use this this NuGet, for example, to see how things align. And again, I'll give you pointers to where you can go find it. But the point is, in this particular application, all I have is a simple solution. And I have dropped the NuGet in here, which is this one file, which is called the Metro Grid Helper. And once I do that, you'll notice that in my applications constructor, I have this one line of code that says, hey, Metro Grid Helper, you need to be visible. So that's one line makes sure that throughout my application, no matter how many pages I have that grid in the background. Right? And you can control the opacity and the colors a little bit if you want, but that's really helpful to make sure that you're sticking to that grid. All right, I'm going to stop this and go back. Now, user journey is important because we are going to try to envision what our app might do. And maybe you decide on like 10 different things, but then you cut down to say, in my first iteration, I'm going to do 3 things. But let's make sure that we are trying to tell a story, right? And this is like the classic monkey to man and then bending over down story. So this part where the man has a phone, this is like the first basic phones where we used to stand up and just walk around with our phones and just like hit walls and things. And then the BlackBerry came along and we started stooping down. And then the iPhone came along and then we were all the way bent all the way over on our phones. So it's okay if your users are bending over to launch your application, see the content for the first time, but let's help them stand up quickly, right? So that's the point. And when we're talking about user journey, it's 3 things we need to keep in mind. We need to attract them, so it needs to be shiny up front. It needs to be something that they would love to explore. And then once they're in the app, you need to delight them in some way and maybe keep doing that over and over again if they keep using your app. And then you need to retain them so that, again, I mean, it takes one tap from the user to uninstall your app. So let's do everything that we can to keep them using our application. These are 2 controls which are very, very commonly used when we try to lay out our Windows Phone apps. Panorama, as we all know, that's a very rich magazine type layout, and most of us start out using the panorama. But sometimes we might forget that there is also the pivot, which can be perfect for your home screen based on the type of content you're presenting. If it's something about filtering and sorting, if you want to keep the user focused and habitual, then pivots may not be a bad thing for you to consider. All right, now we go into planning your app. So now that we have so much of the background, we have some history, we see where they're coming from. Let's see how we can do this, right? So it's okay, like I said, to think big, right? So you try to, you have an idea and you want to do an app. Spend a weekend, and this is one of my, I guess, things where I have gone wrong in the past, where Visual Studio is a very, very easy IDE to use, and I don't think other developers are going to be offended if I say that Windows Phone developers really have some of the best tools available. So when we envision an app, our instinct at first is to go file new project and start right away, right? And that's not the right thing to do, because we are not putting in the effort to plan things up front, right? So spend a weekend on just thinking about what your app, what you want your app to become, and what your app might become in 6 months from now, right? So envision the whole thing, and then maybe you can piecemeal that thing. This is something designers call the information architecture. So think about all the content that you want to present and just break it apart so that you can present the content in a small screen comfortably in every one of your pages, right? So that's your XAML page. And then, you know what, I mean, use anything you want. Use Sketchflow, use PowerPoint, use Expression Blend, or just use pen and paper. That's perfectly fine. If you're on a plane or if you're on a train, all you have is a piece of pen or paper, that's great, because you get to draw it out. And that is a wonderful way of showing it to a friend to say, hey, does this make sense? Like, would you click here if you need to go from this page to another? So rough visuals are very important, because based on that, you are going to get the app to give it more polish. And you're obviously going to have to code it up, but you already have a skeleton of what you want your app to look like. And then at the end of it, we all know we need to make sure there are no bugs, we need to verify, we need to test, and put it through the marketplace, right? So that's our commit and realize. So all I'm trying to say is let's plan well ahead of time. So let's begin with the SDK, what we have, and let's see if we all remember all the things that are available to us up front. So Windows Phone SDK is, again, as we know, it's one free download. It gets us everything from Expression Blend and the virtual machine to run the emulator on. I will show you one thing which is new, and that is I do have the latest SDK, which is 7.1.1. Nokia is going to come out with, I mean, not just Nokia, other OEMs are going to come out with some phones which are going to be 256 megabytes. So these are sort of a lesser phone, if you may say. But I mean, the good news for you as a developer is you don't need to change anything. I mean, there are just two things you need to keep in mind: that your application is not consuming more than 90 megabytes. Your memory footprint isn't more than that. And if you had stuck to the marketplace regulations certification guidelines, your app possibly is less than 90 megabytes. There are some applications that they realized in the marketplace which are actually doing more than 90 megabytes, and Microsoft has actually reached out individually to those developers to help them out. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind. And the other one is, if you notice that in Visual Studio, where we select where we want to run our application, it's either on the Windows Phone device or on the emulator. Now you have two emulators, one which is the regular 512 MB, and then one for 256 megabytes. And you can actually run both these emulators side by side. So it's a great way to make sure that your app works across all types of devices. And the other thing you need to keep in mind is background agents is obviously limited in a low memory device. So, and again, background agents isn't something we should take for granted in regular devices as well, because the max of background agents is like 10 applications. So beyond the 10, the user might not see it, or the user might also disable background agents. So it's not something we should depend on for critical things that your app needs to do. So here's the SDK, and then I also wanted to point out, and I'm sure most of you know by now, we have wonderful emulator tools. If you click on that little right arrow by the emulator, you have an accelerometer simulator, which simulates accelerometer inputs for your phone. If you're doing anything that needs location services, you can use the location tab, and you can record how many times you put push pins on the map, and then the location service will read those inputs and try to take you to those places as if you were reading the inputs. And we obviously know how to take screenshots from the application at 100% magnification. All right, so let's go back. It's important for us to know the app certification requirements, which goes without saying. It's a one-page document, one PDF file. Let's make sure we understand. There's a wonderful marketplace test kit, which, again, if I step out here, if you go into your project, you're going to see this marketplace test kit. What this does, it just helps you around as if your app was being tested by the testing team. So it makes sure all your artwork is ready. It makes sure all your automated tests are successful, that you're not doing a whole lot on startup, that you're exiting correctly, that you honor the back button, and so on. And then there are also some monitor tests, which are nice because it just lets you run your app and do the normal things that the user would do, and then it gives you metrics on how you did, how much was your memory footprint, did your app have unexpected closures, and so on. So definitely make sure you use the marketplace test kit before you publish. We talked about the emulator tools. Isolated Storage Explorer, this was a command line tool, and again, I promise I'll give you links to all of these things. This was a great command line tool to figure out how can I swap out my isolated storage content with some files from my PC, and then how does my app react if I change those files. So the Isolated Storage Explorer is really nice tool to help you with that. In terms of testing, it's always nice to make sure your app is well tested, both in the emulator and on the Windows Phone. One trick I always use is I keep the emulator in one theme, like the dark or the light theme, and I have the phone in the other theme, so it lets me see how the user might perceive my app. Beta testing is available for us, and I think you can have up to 100 testers. So all you need is their live IDs, and you can send them an email with a deep linked app. It doesn't go through as much of certification as you would in a normal submission. But it just helps them test your app for like up to 3 months to make sure that they're satisfied. And give your app to somebody who's not technical, because we developers often get into a mode where we think that certain user experience, the way we're interacting with the app, is the right way, while somebody else might have other ideas, right? And it's important to have unit testing, and at least try doing it, because if we keep putting out updates to our app, which you're expected to as a software vendor, it's important that we don't break core functionality. And Jeff Wilcox has a wonderful unit testing toolkit for Silverlight toolkit, which also works on Windows Phone. It helps you build up a battery of tests so that you can test your core functions before every release. Okay, let's talk about marketing, because now you're into your app, you're developing your app, maybe you've submitted, and you want to make sure that your app gets the right, spotlight. So one thing I want to keep in mind is all the developers which you hear names about where their apps are doing superbly well, it's because these guys have actually spent the effort. They take pride in their creation, right? So it's not like they had an advantage before us. So let's put in that effort, and it's going to show. And if you are doing Windows Phone apps as an individual, you might also have your own company, or you might do it for an enterprise. But if you're an individual, Microsoft calls us ISVs, which are individual software vendors. And I take note of that vendor word, because it really is the first time where individuals need to have that vendor outlook, right? We need to be answerable to all our users. We need to make sure that we are putting out app updates which are not breaking functionality, and we are also taking care of bug fixes and anything that the users might suggest we do. Your app needs to be discoverable, because at this point, Windows Phone Marketplace has about 82,000 apps. It is starting to fill up very quickly, where most common things you will find multiple apps of the same type. Right? So your app needs to shine and be discoverable. So let me show you one quick thing here, maybe. You'll notice that this is my emulator, and I have one app installed here, which is one of my apps. And if I do the Bing search, what I wanted to show you was that App Connect, right? So if I search for Xbox console, you'll notice that what I get here is, depending on what you search for, this could be products or movies or some restaurants. Sometimes they give you these little product cards or flashcards, and when I click on them, it gives me more information about the product, like where can I buy it and reviews and all that. One of the best things they do is they have a tab, or they have a pivot for apps. These are all apps that have registered with Bing to say, hey, with the product of the type Xbox, we can do something about it. And it's a great way to have your app listed here, because it's one way you're kind of sort of advertising your app to the user, right? And these apps don't even need to be installed on the user's phone, because they can click to download. In my case, since it's already there, I can click on it, and you notice that I do something contextual with that string. It's essentially a query parameter that's passed into my app, and as my app launches, I read that query parameter and I say, oh, you search for Xbox, and I'm going to add a wish list to this shopping list application so that you can go buy an Xbox, right? So it's a natural continuation of what the user was trying to do, and it's also a great way for you to emphasize your app even after the user has like 60 apps or 100 apps working on their phone. All right, it's important for us to create a brand for our application, and this is something where we can all improve and we can all do better. It's where your users get the feeling that you are not your app. Your app has its own entity. Maybe it has its own Twitter or its own Facebook profiles, right? There's a wonderful, I guess, a website kit in Coplex, which lets you very quickly make a nice website. You just grab a domain and make a website for your application so that it has a home on the internet, right? And let's promote our apps, right? Any way we can. There is user community on Twitter or Facebook. There are different ways. There are Windows Phone specific websites where we can ask them to do reviews. Any way we can spread the name of our app, that's going to help. All right, so let's talk about the cloud for just a little bit, and I don't want to go a whole lot into it because this could be 1 hour by itself. The fact is, it is a small form factor that we're designing for, and no matter how highly we think of our smartphones, it's still a small battery, a small processor, so anything we can offload from our phones, it's going to help with the battery life and the user experience overall, right? So this is entirely based on what makes sense. So if your app, if you anticipate quite a bit of usage, you're going to have a few users, and even if you don't, I mean, you should look at Azure, you should look at Amazon services and other cloud providers, maybe even just your local ISP, to have something which is like a service that's running outside of your phone. Because then that way you can have live dials. You can have more of the glance and go, where the user does not always need to run your app to figure out what's going on. And I mean, there are some statistics which show that apps with live tiles are an X% more subject to clicks and usage than apps that don't. So let's try doing that. And I mean, even if you don't have like a true live tile which is fed from the cloud, you should at the least do the secondary live tiles that is supported in Mango. One of the things that I try to do myself is take care of my data, right? So my data is the crux of what my app presents. So if I really want to have a shopping list or a to-do list that I want to share between my family members, right? So the only way you can do that is not having the data only on the phone, right? Because then how would your iPhone or your Android or maybe some other Windows phone, how will you read the data? So it needs to be in a central place, and you need to have a strategy to share that data across multiple platforms if you want to take your app to other platforms. So in that regard, something like OData, something like XML or JSON is going to help you out, where you have your data centralized and you just share between different platforms. The cloud has other benefits. If you're presenting things like media, like heavy photographs or audio or video, it helps using something called content delivery nodes. These are about 24 to 26 edge nodes that like Windows Azure has, for example. These are edge nodes or servers that are sitting across like all over the world in different continents. So if you're in Asia or Europe or Australia, your users can get the content from the server that's closest to them, and that's going to help with the user experience. In that regard, there are some toolkits if you want to use Azure. These toolkits actually help you as a mobile developer just use Azure, and they do not expect a whole lot of knowledge from you in terms of cloud computing, because they are literally asking Windows Phone, iOS, and Android developers to come and leverage Azure as a resource. And also, most people who use Windows Phone, they possibly know what SkyDrive is. They have their Hotmail or their Live accounts. So Live APIs is a wonderful way to augment your app and the storage on your app. Maybe you use some Hotmail features, maybe you use some SkyDrive features to put out storage away from your app into SkyDrive. So take a look at those and see if it makes sense for your application. All right, let's talk about monetization a little bit. What we are building needs to be appropriate to your effort, right? So one thing I commonly hear people say is, I gave my app away for free because I just didn't want to charge for it, and that's not always right, because I mean, if you spend a good amount of effort and time on making an app, people will be happy to pay 99 cents or whatever be the price of it. So let's make sure we price our creation sensibly. I mean, it should be appropriate to what your application does. There's a wonderful trial mode, which is very, very easy to implement. There's like one flag that you get from the marketplace that shows whether your app is in trial mode or whether somebody has actually bought it. So you could consider a trial mode with some advertisements thrown in, if that makes sense for you, and then maybe after every 10 attempts you ask the user to see if they want to review it or maybe they want to buy it, right? So consider what makes sense, whether you want to go all paid or do you want to go ad supported with a free application, right? And if you're doing ads, and there are others, I'm just mentioning two because these are two that I personally like the most. There is the Microsoft Pub Center, which is the default ad control that you get from the SDK. And Alan Mendelovich, if I'm pronouncing the name right, he's over in Europe and he does ad duplex, which is, again, a wonderful way of advertising. I mean, it's an ad exchange network, so your app advertises somebody else's app and so on, and the other person is going to also advertise your app, so it's like a two-way thing. There is also a control in CodeClick called Ad Rotator. This lets us put in an ad control and then subscribe to multiple feeds from maybe Pub Center and Ad Duplex and Google and so on. So take a look at all your options and try to spread the word as much as possible, because the more people know about it, they're going to try at least using a trial mode, and maybe they'll convert over and do a formal buy. One of the things that we sometimes get asked, give me 1 second here. All right, a gulp of water helps. So one thing that we commonly get asked is, can we do in-app purchases? And that's something that's supported in just a couple of Xbox type games right now. It's something that may or may not be coming in the foreseeable future. Most possibly is coming. So that's another avenue if you want to do continuous in-app purchases to make more money off your app. All right, so let's talk about toolkits and all the things that are at our disposal. One of the things that we need to make sure that we understand is there is a certain right tool for every job, right? So there are plenty of things that have been made so far. So let's make sure that we do not reinvent the wheel, right? If you sit down and if you try writing an app and you realize that you need a very custom, complex control, it's okay for you to look around and maybe make it yourself, but at the very least you should take a look around to see what's already out there. There's a lot of open source stuff out there for Windows Phone, and there is some which may be something you'll pay for, but it may be a very, very good investment because it's coming from professionals who know exactly what they're doing. So some common toolkits that I always try to use myself, or just look around to see if their controls make sense for me. Things like the Windows Phone Silverlight Toolkit. This is, again, Jeff Wilcox and those guys from the Windows Phone team. So it is made by the guys who work on Windows Phones. So it's very reliable for you to use. And then Clint Rutkas and some of those guys make the Coding for Fun Toolkit, which is also a great list of, I think, 8 or 10 controls, which are not something you'll find in the default SDK. If you want to use push notifications, and again, let me bring it back to my emulator here. You'll see how the push notifications help. Like these two are two live tiles. You see that I have 2 cities pinned, so it's just a richer experience, and they will flip because these are secondary live tiles. So sometimes these push notifications, I mean, you might be a little stretched to figure out all of that by yourself, where you're trying to host your services in the cloud. There's a notification server helper for you. Let me back up one step, maybe so you don't see that line. Okay, that's better. So there's a push notification server helper which will actually help you send out these tiles or toasts or even raw messages to your phone. It's just a very nice helper that you can use in your server-side code so that you're doing these push notifications very easily. StirlingDB, this is something Jeremy Lickness and his team makes. If you're looking to maybe have relational data, you should consider SQL and see how that works. If you can stay with some like NoSQL type implementation where it's not truly relational, but you want to have the benefit of automatic serialization, deserialization, and most importantly indexing, then that StirlingDB is something you should definitely look at. Because what it does is, let's say you have 1,000 customers in your isolated storage, if your app deals with customers. And then if you want to search for one, you should not bring all 1,000 out into memory and search for it, because then that's not the most memory efficient way of doing things, right? So churning really helps you because it does indexing on those records, and it helps you find the thing that you're looking for. So link to object is very easy. There are other ones. There are like sharp ziblib. There's JSON.NET if you want to parse JSON. There are Signal R libraries if you want to do real-time communication. Peter Kuhn, who's another presenter for Silverlight, he has a wonderful toolkit called YLAD. So these things are available as libraries and NuGets. So just take a look around to see what's already there before you create your own. And like I said, over the last few months, the third-party ecosystem for Windows Phone has really come together. And if you look at some of the major control vendors, Teneric, Component One, and Infrajustice, and I'm sure I'm missing somebody out here, but the point is they make wonderful controls. And these are people who are experts in XAML, and they design their controls to be extremely performing so that you don't need to worry about your data binding and the use of your controls, and it looks great out of the box, right? So some of them are things you might need to pay for, and again, if you do pay for, it's only, you can just buy the Windows Phone controls, or if you are, if you're going to user groups, if you are into the community, you might be able to get hold of people who might give you a trial, or maybe you can win some of these controls. But the point is, take a look at everything that's out there right now, and the ecosystem for Windows Phone is building up very, very nicely. There are lots of controls for you to use. All right, let's talk about patterns and frameworks for a second. Most of us possibly work on large software development projects. We might be in the enterprise, and we often see that like code bases are very, I guess code bases can be very messy, right? There can be hundreds and thousands of lines of code, things that are hard to follow, and so on. If you're doing Windows Phone development, right, you are doing it individually, or maybe you're doing it with a couple of buddies. It's a smaller group, right? So let's not bring any mess into our application code bases unless it's like it's really worth it, right? So as your code base grows, as you put out more updates for your application, it's going to start getting more complex, right? And that's when you should look at some patterns and some frameworks, some software development design patterns that are going to help. You can look at MVC or MVP or MVVM. Any of those things are going to give you separation of concerns. So as you change one thing in your business logic, you don't need to worry about 3 different UI screens that may be using that business logic. So it gives you that separation of concerns, right? You can absolutely do MVVM on your own. You just need to separate out your views and your view models and your controllers. But you can also start with one of the toolkits, which will actually help you get a little further down the line. Things like MVVM Lite from Lauren Bunyan, Ultralight MVVM, and Caliban Macro, they are all very well regarded toolkits from the community. Also, it's very important to do performance tuning, which is something we should always keep in mind, because it's a touch-based application that you're building, and you might be downloading a huge amount of content from the internet, but the user still needs to be able to touch your screen and swipe his finger around, right? So you need to be responsive at all times. So blocking up the UI thread is just not an option. There is a performance profiler built into the Windows Phone SDK right now. So take a look at that. See how your memory footprint looks like, and see which screens you can help. Right? If you're doing data binding, make sure that you are not data binding to like a huge collection. So if you have a list box, and if you bind to 100,000 records, it's going to virtualize, but it's going to take a little while to figure out that virtualization if you have a complex template in it. Right? So be mindful of the data that you bind to, and also maybe take a look at some of the list box type controls that other vendors have, because they might already have some performance optimizations built in. All right, we talked about background agents towards the start, but it's not just for the newer 256 megabyte devices. There are constraints on background agents, and let's make sure that we are not setting ourselves up for failure. There are some constraints, like background agents can be either periodic tasks or the resource-intensive tasks. The resource-intensive ones can only happen when the phone is in, like you're charging the phone, or it's in Wi-Fi, or if the screen is off, and so on. The periodic tasks are more like things that happen more commonly, like every half an hour or so. And there are some restrictions on it. You cannot exceed more than 6 megabytes of memory footprint. You only get a few processing cycles to do your thing. So if you are doing an extremely large amount of operations, you're going to time out. And if the OS sees that your background agent has timed out more than twice, guess what? It's going to kill that process, right? So you want to make sure that we're doing little and only as much as needed in our background engines. Sequency, again, I mean, I have not had the need to truly use a relational database in my phone apps yet, but if you do need to, I mean, absolutely go ahead. But you will just need to make sure you know that there's a little bit of a performance hit because it's an abstraction on top of your isolated storage. But it may not be noticeable. SQL Suite is great if you really need relational databases. All right, we got about 9 minutes, so we are on time. So let's talk about resource usage, right? One of the things we need to keep in mind is not everybody who is using our application has an unlimited data plan, right? So data or bandwidth is something we need to keep in mind. Also, the phone does not have unlimited memory, right? So we need to be a little careful about the fact that our app needs to be performing like comfortably in the phone's ecosystem, and we're not doing things which we don't need to, like overdoing the bandwidth usage and so on, right? So you need to know the execution model of the application lifecycle of your applications. So what are the different states that your application is going through? When is it active? When is it dormant? When is it tombstoned? How is it coming out of tombstoning? Are you preserving state correctly, right? Those are all things that it gives the user the feeling that your app never died and it's just running all the time. So make sure you understand multitasking and FAST, which is fast application switching. Make sure you understand those things well. Threading is something, again, the phone does not have unlimited resources. We need to be a little careful here. We can absolutely never lock up the UI thread, as we know in Windows 8 or in Windows Phone. So we need to be careful on doing things asynchronously. And some of the things that are already built into the SDK, like the web clients, if you're making a network call, they already do things behind the scenes. But if you have really a lot of heavy processing going on, feel free to use like a background thread, which does not lock up the UI. Like I said, bandwidth isn't something which is free, so we should really try to cache everything that we could reuse. So if I use your social app one time, the next time I launch it, you should at least start with the cache that you already have. Maybe if you're making like a RSS reader, you should start with what you already have and then try to pull down fresh content, right? So it saves network calls unless you really need to. And again, startup is something we need to be aware of because we only get about 3 to 5 seconds before the user hits the app tile, and then your app needs to be running on the home screen and be responsive. So let's not do a whole bunch of processing and a whole bunch of network calls while the app is starting up because it's going to slow us down. And it's perfectly okay to bring the user to a home screen and then make some network calls and show them a progress bar to say, hey, we're doing something. But startup needs to be quick. And the reason why I say APIs, we need to be careful about APIs, is there are things like alarms and reminders. Some of them you might be able to create some of these without user interaction. So please don't overdo it. There's a limit on like 50, and plus the user might get all confused why he sees so many alarms and reminders. There are things like contacts, which actually you can now get a list of all the contacts that the person has on the phone. It's read-only, but don't like push out the contacts to your local server somewhere else, because again, the user is going to realize, somebody's going to realize, and then your app is going to get bad reviews and so on. All right, so we are close to the end, and most importantly, we just need to have fun, right? Again, I personally do Windows Phone development on my spare time, and maybe some of it for my company, but if you are doing it on your spare time, please have fun, because that's what is going to keep you productive. You are taking time away from your family, you're taking time away from something else you might be doing to do Windows Phone development, right? So make sure you're enjoying it. We, over the last 1.5 to 2 years, we have built up an absolutely awesome Windows Phone community on your social networks or on Stack Overflow or on any other forums. So lean on the community. If you're stuck on something, don't spend like days and days trying to figure out what you need to do. And Windows Phone development should be a happy part of your day, right? It should give you pleasure in building something which you can run on your phone, right? And enjoy the wider ecosystem, and by that I mean this screen here, where starting 2012, your phone and your PC and your Xbox connected TV look very, very similar, right? So really imbibe the Metro design principles and really try to make great applications. And I'm not saying this because you need to do it, because I need to do it as well. So all of us. So let's put in the right effort to make beautiful, performant apps, and I'm sure your users will thank you for that. All right, so we're at 1:58, and it's about time. Oh, and I did want to give you some people to follow. And most of these things that I have learned or said today, much of these are from these 4 or 5 guys. Samuel Moreau, Brian Agnata, and Arturo Toledo. These are folks who do Windows Phone design or UX type work. They are great people to follow on social media because they have articles. They have article series. Arturo was doing a 31 weeks of Windows Phone design series, so great resources to keep around. And most of us know Jeff Wilcox. He has actually moved on to the Azure team right now, but he is still very involved in Windows Phone. He actually makes the Fulton Mayor application for Windows Phone. And everything that I said, all these different controls and toolkits and resources that I said, back in January or February, I think I did a little series on my blog, which is myfullname.com, on 7 deadly sins for Windows Phone developers. And what it does is just talks about sins and things that we should not do as Windows Phone developers. I mean, I just tried having a little bit of fun trying to map the sins to what we should not do. But every one of these, I mean, it's a list of 7 articles, and they have links and resources for every one of these things that we've said today. So take a look. I would appreciate if you leave me some feedback, but I just want to list out all the resources that are available for us as we do our Windows Phone development. All right, so I don't know if Svetla is back on, but we are...
Okay, Sam,
so we have, go on, sorry.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was quite an interesting one. Just wanted to invite everyone to send their questions using the chat option in their webinar panels. We already got a bunch of questions from Daniel Fox, so maybe Samidp, you can proceed with those. Just make sure you read the question before you reply, so everyone can hear it, and then proceed with the reply. All right, so well, I have assigned them, so you should be able to see them.
Yeah, it's a little small text, so give me 1 second to read it here. I'm not seeing the name of the person who asked the question yet, maybe.
Yes, Daniel
I'll read.
Fox.
Okay, so I'll read the question here. So are push notifications only available on Windows Server? What if the server is Linux-based? What other possibilities do I have for server-based services like push services or cloud-based services in general? Are there any services for Unix systems that can be used in collaboration with Windows Phone? Okay, that's a great question. And one of the things we try selling is reusability, because when you talk about these push notifications, it really boils down to just sticking to some XML packets, right? So from the server, when you're sending something to the phone, you're essentially sending a little XML package that the Windows Phone OS can understand. Like this is a tile versus this is a toast, right? And raw messages are different because your app processes them by themselves or by itself when it's running. So your backend services absolutely do not need to be Windows-based. I mean, you can host it anywhere you want. It can be written in anything you want. For example, I talked about Fulton Mayor, which is Jeff Wilcox's apps. He has about 70,000 users, and his backend is Node.js running on Azure, or maybe it's running on Amazon. So the backend is really flexible, and what you're going to do is create something which can essentially make an HTTP post request to a Microsoft push notification service, because that service knows the unique URL, the unique channel URI that identifies every phone and every application. So all you need to do is make up that XML package and do an HTTP post on it. And you can use any technology to make that happen. As long as you're making that one HTTP post, it should work with push notifications. And the other great thing is you can actually have one backend that supports your Windows Phone, or maybe you have some iOS or Android users. Maybe the same backend is going to do push notifications for Windows 8, like if you have like a tablet type application. So really, reuse is what we're trying to focus on, and any technology works as long as you're able to make up that little HTTP or XML package. All right, I hope that answered the question. Again, I mean, please feel free to reach out to me beyond this webinar. Svetla, is there anything else?
Yes, I just assigned one more question about push notifications. It's from Daniel Cupola. You should be able to see it in your...
Okay. Tell us more about push notification, server helper, and beta testing. Okay. Those are 2 slightly different things. So the beta testing, I will try to maybe tweet out something after this webinar where I actually have those links. But essentially, beta testing is a way where you submit your application to the marketplace. but you do not want to make it live and searchable by everybody. So not everybody sees it. You are only allowing a closed group of your friends, maybe, of your family, maybe, to say, hey, can you guys test this app for me and make sure it's good to go? So you essentially need their live IDs, and by that I mean your email, your live email or your Hotmail email, and they get an email saying, here's a deep link to this application that this person is trying to make, just help it test. So they can do one tap on that link and then install the app on their phone. They can test it out and then give you feedback. So that's beta testing, and I think that's a great way of using. I mean, there are actually some websites that have built up where you can go and sign up and say, hey, I want some testers for my application. These websites are going to list out a few people. There are some volunteers always, and again, I'll tweet out a link to that. But you essentially get a large group of developers as beta testers, which is quite fantastic. All right, so the question was, tell us more about push notification server helper. Again, I will tweet it out. I believe it was Matt Lacey from London who wrote this. Essentially, you need to, I wish I had more time to show you some code, but essentially, you need to build up that XML package, which makes up a push notification to the phone. And that XML package has a certain structure so that it knows what a tile is, it knows what a toast is, and the fact that Windows Phone OS can process that. So you needed to make up that XML package through maybe like a bit stream, and then you needed to do an HTTP web request, or which is an HTTP post request to that channel URI, which is the unique URI for the user and for his application. And so all of that meant a little bit of coding, and it was a little bit of complex code where you needed to write up, where you needed to build out that XML package and then send it away. So that library, and again I'll shoot out a link for that. The library essentially helps you say just send tile, send toast, and send raw, something like that. And then the send tile essentially takes in whatever content you want to push out, and then it behind the scenes it builds up the XML, and it also does an HTTP post to MPLS, the Microsoft Push Notification Service, so that it can push out that to all the different phones and all the different customers on that application. So that's all about the Push Notification Server helper. Is there anything else, Swadla?
No other questions so far. So if anyone has a question after the webinar, feel free to address it to either editorial@silverlightshow.net or to Samidp. You have his Twitter account. He left his contact details.
I brought it up again. Yep. So email me, Twitter, reach me on Twitter anyway, and I'll try my best to help you out.
All right. So this wraps up this, I think, very interesting webinar session. So thanks, Samidp. Hope to see you again in some of our next webinars.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone who attended, and it's always a pleasure.
Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to leave their feedback on this webinar, recommendations for improvement in the survey displayed after you exit this webinar. You can win some ebooks, and we'll be glad to address any recommendations you have. So thanks again for attending. Hope you enjoyed this webinar session, and we welcome you to the next webinars by Silverlight Show. We have 2 more webinars in April. One is with Peter Kuhn. It's again a Windows Phone webinar, and we have a Windows 8 webinar with Joe Clarin. So you can check out this, the information on the upcoming webinars on Silverlight Show webinars page. And I want to wish you a good day or a good evening. Thank you again. Thanks, Sam.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.